Thought I was asleep when she made the call. I wasn't. I was sitting in the kitchen at 5 in the morning, the way I've done every morning for the past 40 years, waiting for the coffee to finish and listening to the house settle around me. Our house, the one I built from nothing in 1987, when this neighborhood was still dirt roads and optimism. My daughter-in-law's voice carried down the hallway clear as anything. "You won't fight it," she said. "Trust me. He's 68 years old, and he doesn't want the stress. We just have to move fast." I set my mug down on the counter very slowly. Move fast. I'd heard those words before, years ago, back when I was still a partner at my engineering firm and we were closing deals that made younger men nervous. Move fast meant someone was trying to get something done before the other party had time to think. It was never a phrase that came from a position of respect. I poured my coffee and I went back to my chair by the window. And I sat there watching the sun come up over my backyard, over the oak tree I planted the year my son was born, and I thought about what I was going to do. Let me back up, because none of this came out of nowhere, even if it felt that way to me in those first few weeks. My son. I'll call him my son, because that's what he is. Whatever he's become. Married his wife about 6 years ago. I liked her well enough at the start. She was sharp, ambitious, the kind of woman who always had an angle on a situation. I admired that. I'd built my whole career on seeing angles other people missed. What I didn't see, not right away, was that her angle included me. My wife passed 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 11 weeks from diagnosis to funeral. And I spent every one of those weeks at her side in a way that still makes me proud when I think about it, and still breaks me open when I think about it too long. After she was gone, the house felt different, not empty exactly, but changed. The way a room changes when you move the furniture. Same dimensions, different feel. My son started coming around more after that. His wife, too. They'd bring dinner on Sundays, help with yard work, sit with me on the back porch, and talk about nothing in particular. I told myself this was just family. This was what family did. But there were comments, small ones, that I didn't pay enough attention to at the time. "Dad, you don't need all this space. This place must be a lot to maintain on your own. Have you ever thought about downsizing? A nice condo somewhere. Low maintenance. You could travel." I'd wave them off. I didn't want a condo. I wanted my house, my backyard, the oak tree I planted, the workshop in the garage where I still spent 3 or 4 evenings a week building furniture the way my father taught me. This was my life. This was the life I'd built. The property, just so you understand the scale of what I'm talking about, is worth somewhere between $900,000 and $1.5 million, depending on the market. It's 4 acres in a part of Northern Virginia that developers have been circling for 15 years. My neighbors on either side have both sold. I never did. My wife and I decided a long time ago that we'd pass it to our son, free and clear, as his inheritance. We never put that in writing. We never thought we had to. That was our mistake. 8 months before that morning in the kitchen, my son sat me down at the dining room table with what I can only describe as a business proposal. He'd been working with a developer, a company out of McLean that wanted to build a planned community on several connected parcels in the area, and my land was the missing piece. My son had already had preliminary conversations with them. The number he put in front of me was real money, enough that I wouldn't have to worry about anything for the rest of my life, enough to leave something behind for grandchildren I didn't even have yet. "All you'd have to do is sign," he said. "We handle everything. You could move into that new senior community over on Route 7. You'd have people around you. Activities. It's really nice, Dad. I've toured it." I looked at him across the table, my son, 53 years old at that point, a man I raised, a man I coached through Little League and helped through 2 semesters of college calculus, and stood next to at his mother's funeral. And I said, "I don't want to sell. Dad, I don't want to sell. This is where I live. This is my home." His wife was in the kitchen, and I heard her set something down on the counter harder than she needed to. My son looked at his hands. Okay, he said. Okay, we can talk about it later. But later kept coming. Every Sunday dinner, every phone call, every visit, there was some version of the same conversation. My son's wife started bringing printouts, listings for senior communities, articles about aging in place versus community living. Once a brochure for a place in Scottsdale, Arizona, as if I'd expressed any interest whatsoever in moving to the desert. I was patient. I kept saying no. I thought that was the end of it. Then, about 5 months ago, I got a call from my accountant. My accountant and I have worked together for 22 years. He's the kind of man who calls once a year at tax time and otherwise leaves you alone, which I consider a professional virtue. So when he called me on a Thursday afternoon in October, I knew before I answered that something was wrong. "I need you to come in," he said. "There's something I need to show you in person." He'd received a request, he explained, when I was sitting across his desk the next morning, a formal request through a title company for records related to the property. Not just the property value or the tax history. Records related to ownership transfer. The letter referenced a power of attorney document that supposedly authorized my son to act on my behalf in real estate transactions. I told my accountant I had never signed a power of attorney giving my son that authority. He slid a copy of the document across the desk. My signature was on it, except it wasn't my signature. I looked at it for a long time. It was close. Whoever did it had studied my handwriting, captured the particular way I make the loop on the G in my last name. The slight forward lean I've always had. But it wasn't mine. The date on the document was from 2 years ago, a period when I'd been recovering from a knee replacement and had signed several legitimate documents my son had brought to the hospital for me. Medical proxies, insurance paperwork, standard things. Somewhere in that stack, apparently, was something that wasn't standard. I sat in my accountant's office and I felt something I hadn't felt since the early days of my career. Back when I was young and hungry and someone tried to cut me out of my first major contract. It wasn't panic. It wasn't even anger, exactly. It was a cold, clear, focused feeling like the moment before you make a very important cut in a piece of wood, when everything goes quiet and you see exactly where the line needs to go. "Don't tell anyone you came in," I said to my accountant. "Don't respond to the title company yet. Give me 2 weeks. He looked at me over his glasses. He's known me for 22 years. "All right," he said. I spent the first week making phone calls. The first was to an attorney. Not the family lawyer my son and I had both used over the years, but someone new. A woman who specialized in elder financial abuse and estate litigation. Her office was in Arlington, and she had 17 years of experience and the handshake that felt like she meant business. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is rarer than it sounds. When I was done, she said, "Do you still have the originals of the documents you signed during your recovery?" I did. "I keep records of everything. 40 years in engineering will do that to you." "Good," she said. "Don't confront your son yet. Don't change your behavior at all. Sunday dinners, phone calls, all of it continues exactly as normal. Can you do that?" I thought about my son sitting across the dining room table, his wife in the kitchen, the brochures for senior communities. "Yes," I said, "I can do that." The second call was to a forensic document examiner. She worked with my attorney regularly and had testified as an expert witness in over 40 cases. She examined the signature on the power of attorney and the originals I'd kept from my recovery period, and produced a written analysis in 11 days. Her conclusion was unambiguous. The signature was a forgery. The third call was to a private investigator, because I wanted to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with before I did anything else. He was a former Secret Service agent, retired, who had pivoted into financial fraud investigations. He was expensive, and he was worth it. What he found over the following 3 weeks was worse than I'd expected. The developer my son had been negotiating with was real. The offer was real. My son had according to documentation the investigator obtained, been negotiating as my authorized representative for over a year, representing to the developer that he had full authority to execute a sale. He had not disclosed that the power of attorney was disputed, or that I had repeatedly and explicitly declined to sell. He had already received a good faith payment, a preliminary consulting fee the developer had paid him personally, separate from any eventual sale proceeds of $45,000. $45,000. I turned that number over in my mind while I was driving home from the investigator's office, watching the Virginia countryside go by outside the window, thinking about Sunday dinners. Here is where I need to tell you about the farm. When my wife and I bought this property in 1987, it came with something most people didn't know about. 3.5 of the 4 acres were what we always called the house parcel. The main property, the house, the workshop, the yard, but the remaining ½ acre, at the back, along the property line that borders what used to be old farmland, was held under a separate deed, one that my wife and I had, entirely on our own initiative, placed into an irrevocable trust in 2003. We'd done it for estate planning reasons at the recommendation of our financial advisor at the time. The trust was structured so that the property could only be distributed to direct heirs, and only with the approval of an independent trustee, a provision we'd included specifically to protect against either of us making rash decisions in old age. My son knew the house existed. He did not know about the trust. I'm not sure he knew about the separate deed. He certainly didn't know when he forged my signature on that power of attorney and spent 14 months negotiating with the developer that the developer's entire project, the planned community, the access roads, the utility easements, all of it depended on that back ½ acre. You cannot build what they were planning to build without it. My attorney confirmed this after reviewing the developer's site plans, which were part of the public record for the county permit application. The access road they'd designed required an easement to cross that back parcel. Without it, the project wasn't viable. I sat in my attorney's office and I heard her explain this to me in her calm, precise way. And I thought about my son saying, "All you have to do is sign. We handle everything." And for the first time in months, I felt something other than cold clarity. I felt tired. And then I felt something that surprised me. I felt something like relief. Not because I had won yet, but because I understood now that the ground I was standing on was solid, and my son had been building on air. I want to be honest about what the next part cost me, because I don't think these stories always tell you that. The Sunday dinners continued. I sat across the table from my son and his wife, and I ate the food they brought. And I talked about the weather and my workshop and the neighbors, and I watched my son's wife refill my water glass with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. And I thought about the document examiner's report sitting in a locked drawer in my desk at home. There were moments when I almost said something, when my son laughed at something on the television, and for a second he was just my son, the kid who used to fall asleep on the couch watching baseball, and I had to excuse myself to the workshop and stand in the dark for a few minutes with my hand on a piece of walnut I'd been shaping, feeling the grain under my fingertips until the moment passed. I don't tell you this to make myself sound noble. I tell you because I think sometimes when people hear these stories, they imagine the wronged party as someone perfectly composed, strategically calculating at every moment, never wavering. That's not how it was. I wavered. I was 68 years old, and my son had forged my signature, and I was eating dinner with him every Sunday and pretending I didn't know. It cost me something. It cost me something I won't ever fully get back. But I kept going. My attorney filed a complaint on a Wednesday morning in February, a civil action for fraud, elder financial exploitation, and forgery, naming my son and his wife as co-defendants, along with a separate notification to the county sheriff's office and the state attorney general's elder abuse unit. She also sent a certified letter to the developer informing them that the power of attorney they had been relying on was fraudulent, that I had never authorized any sale, and that the trust parcel, the one their entire project depended on, was not mine to sell under any circumstances, trust terms or otherwise. The developer's attorney called my attorney within 4 hours. I was not there for what happened next, but my attorney described it to me that evening over the phone, and I have thought about it many times since. My son and his wife had apparently been at a lunch meeting with the developer that very day, finalizing details, presumably believing everything was still on track. The developer's legal team interrupted that meeting to inform them that the project was on hold pending investigation of the power of attorney. My son called me that afternoon. I let it go to voicemail. His wife called 20 minutes later. I let that go too. His message said there had been a misunderstanding, that we needed to talk, that there was an explanation for everything. His wife's message was shorter and less composed. I listened to both of them sitting in my kitchen, the same chair I'd been in the morning. I overheard her say we just have to move fast, and I felt the particular satisfaction of a man who has cut along the right line and watched the wood split exactly where he planned. The sheriff's deputies came to their house on a Thursday morning, which I know because my son called me from the front porch while it was happening, apparently under the impression that I might intervene. "Dad," he said, and his voice was different from any voice I'd heard from him in years, not the careful, managed voice he'd been using at Sunday dinners, not the persuasive voice from the dining room table, but something younger, something closer to the boy he used to be. "Dad, please," I said, "I have an attorney. You should call yours." And then I hung up. The charges that were ultimately filed included fraud, forgery, and financial exploitation of an elderly person, the last of which carries enhanced penalties under Virginia law. The developer, facing their own exposure for proceeding with a transaction involving a potentially fraudulent POA, cooperated fully with investigators. The $45,000 payment to my son was documented in their records. That became part of the case. My son's wife hired a criminal defense attorney within 24 hours. My son hired one 2 days later. They are no longer living together, as of the last information I have. The developer, after several months of legal maneuvering, approached my attorney with a legitimate offer. A real one. Negotiated with me present, structured as a partial sale of a portion of the main parcel only, with full retention of the trust property and an easement arrangement that protected my right to remain in the house for the rest of my life. The number was different from the one my son had negotiated. It was better. I thought about it for 3 weeks. I called my wife's sister, who is 81 and still sharper than most people I know, and talked through the whole thing with her over 2 hours on the phone. I bought my property on a cold March morning, all 4 acres of it. From the oak tree my son was born the same year I planted, to the back fence, to the workshop, to the front porch where I've had coffee every morning for 37 years. Then I called my attorney and told her I'd accept. The closing happened on a Tuesday in April. I shook hands with the developer's representative in a conference room in Arlington, signed my name, my real name, my actual signature, on documents that were legitimate, and walked out into a parking lot with enough money and a wire transfer confirmation to take care of myself for whatever years I have left, and a piece of paper guaranteeing me the right to stay in my house, in my home, for the rest of my life. My son pled guilty to 1 count of fraud and 1 count of elder financial exploitation. His wife accepted a plea on the exploitation charge. Their sentences included probation, mandatory restitution, and community service. The criminal record stays. I don't know what they tell people about what happened. I don't have any communication with either of them. I want to be careful here about what I say, because I know what people sometimes expect from the end of a story like this. They expect either forgiveness or bitterness, and I have neither to offer. What I have is something quieter. I raised my son. I loved him for 53 years, and I love him now in the way you love something you've lost, which is different from the way you love something you still have. Some mornings I sit in my kitchen and I don't think about any of it. Some mornings I think about it more than I'd like. The oak tree is still out back. I can see it from my chair. Last fall I finished a rocking chair in the workshop. Black walnut, hand-joined. The design my father taught me when I was about 12 years old. It's the best piece I've ever built. I put it on the front porch, and in the evenings when the light is right, I sit in it and watch the neighborhood and drink my coffee. and I think about how a man can spend his whole life building something solid, and how solid things, if you take care of them, have a way of outlasting everything that comes against them. I'm still here. That's enough. There's a rocking chair on my front porch now. Black walnut, hand-joined, the same design my father taught me when I was 12 years old. Some evenings I sit in it and I think about how long it actually takes for consequences to catch up with the choices people make, and how patient a man has to be to let that process run its course without interfering. My son didn't fail because he was unlucky. He failed because he made a series of decisions that each required the next one to work, and none of them were built on anything true. That's not bad luck. That's a structure with no foundation. I spent 40 years in engineering. I know what happens to structures with no foundation. It doesn't matter how confident the people inside them sound. It doesn't matter how fast they move. The math doesn't change. What I keep coming back to, turning it over the way you turn a piece of wood in your hands before you cut it, is the question of character. Not in a preachy sense. I'm not a preacher, and I never wanted to be. But I think there's something real in the idea that who you are when no one is watching is the only version of yourself that actually counts. My son, when no one was watching, was willing to forge his father's signature. His wife, when no one was watching, was willing to plan around an old man's grief. Those weren't accidents. Those were choices that came from somewhere deep, from a place that had been developing for years before I saw any sign of it at Sunday dinner. I think about what I did differently, and I don't say this to congratulate myself because I made plenty of mistakes in this story. The biggest one was trusting without verifying for years simply because the people involved were family. But when the moment came, I kept my head. I didn't react from anger. I didn't confront and escalate and give them time to cover their tracks. I thought first. I moved carefully. I relied on people who knew more than I did about specific things, my attorney, the document examiner, the investigator, instead of assuming that because I was smart enough in general, I was smart enough in particular. That discipline, the willingness to think before acting even when every instinct was telling me to pick up the phone and say what I knew. That's the thing I'm most grateful I held on to. And then there's the part that doesn't get talked about enough in stories like this, which is the part where you have to keep going after it's over. The legal process took the better part of a year. The grief, because that's what it is, grieving a version of your son you thought you knew, doesn't resolve on a schedule. There were mornings when the settlement felt hollow, and the house felt too quiet, and I wasn't sure the rocking chair was enough. Getting through those mornings wasn't strategy. It was just stubbornness. The same stubbornness that kept me at my drafting table at 2 in the morning in 1987 when the project was behind and the money was short. You keep showing up. You don't let the hard thing be the last thing. The oak tree in my backyard is 37 years old. I planted it the year my son was born. It's taller than the house now. I'm still here too.